As a retired forensic doctor, I have many stories to tell from when I worked in the morgue. This happened a few years before I retired, but it feels like it was yesterday. That night, I was alone in the last morgue I worked at. I had a colleague who worked the same shift as me, but that night specifically, she asked for permission to be absent because her husband had an accident and was in the hospital. As a retired forensic doctor, I have many stories to tell from when I worked in the morgue. This happened a few years before I retired, but it feels like it was yesterday. That night, I was alone in the last morgue I worked at. I had a colleague who worked the same shift as me, but that night specifically, she asked for permission to be absent because her husband had an accident and was in the hospital. Only the father, who was driving, survived, but in critical condition. All the bodies were brought in to perform the necessary procedures, as well as to fill out the papers and documents required in such cases. Having no other option, I decided to start with the little girl. Even as a professional, it always made me sad to see a child in that place with a whole life ahead, especially if you have children. I transported the girl to the room to begin all the procedures. The other bodies, including the mother's, were left in another waiting room. Just as I started my work with the little one, I heard noises from where the other bodies were. As I said earlier, the place was empty. Besides me, only the guard was present, but at his post outside. So, I decided to ignore it and continue with my work. But a few minutes later, the noise returned. This time, it sounded like a soft moan, but unmistakable. I decided to go out and investigate to see what was happening. I walked down the hall and entered the room where the bodies were waiting, but there was no one there, at least no one alive. I turned off the light and went to the reception to take a look, taking the opportunity to go to the bathroom. When I returned to where the girl was, I noticed stains on the floor that looked like blood but were very faint. I also noticed that the girl had a blood mark on her right hand, something that definitely wasn't there when I had left her minutes before. She had died from a severe blow to the head, but her small body was intact. The one who had suffered several serious injuries was her mother. I was very confused because deep down, I didn't know where those stains on the floor came from. I decided not to think too much about it and continue with the work because I still had a lot to do. After a while, almost finishing my notes on the girl's body, I heard noises and moans again coming from the other room. That was enough for me, and I decided to check once more. There, I saw something that left me so impacted that to this day, I feel the same effect when I remember it. The girl's mother's body had one leg hanging off the stretcher and a hand sticking out from under the sheet. She definitely hadn't been left like that. She was completely lying on the stretcher, with her hands and feet on it, and covered with the sheet. Honestly, I was very shocked, mainly because I noticed blood dripping from one of her hands. Call me crazy or an unethical professional, but I was sure it was her who went to see her daughter in the autopsy room and held her hand. That's why the stains on the floor and on the little girl's hand. I decided to lock the room until I finished what I had to do. I have no idea how I continued working that night after what happened. I suppose that years of experience ended up sustaining me, but more than the fear I felt, I was moved because it was a mother who wanted to be with her daughter. After that, the noises continued. When I put the girl in the cold room, I decided it was her mother's turn, so they could finally be together. When I brought her to the room and started working on her, the noises completely stopped. For the rest of the night, I didn't hear anything else. I never managed to forget this event. After everything I went through during those procedures, I could only believe that it really was the mother wanting to be with her daughter.
My name is Arthur, and I want to share my story with you. I have been a forensic doctor for 10 years and have worked in several morgues throughout my career. It's already routine for me to see all kinds of corpses and work with them at night, which is when my shifts usually fall. But when I started working at this morgue, everything was different. One night, we were working as usual, my colleague and I, when late into the night, we received the body of an elderly woman in an advanced state of decomposition. The people in charge of collecting the bodies told us that she was alone, that she had no family, and that it was the neighbors who noticed she had died because of the odor emanating from her house. We proceeded with the autopsy and legal procedures. When we finished, we placed her in the cold room. We were chatting when, for some reason, the atmosphere became heavy, and we started to feel bad, anxious. Definitely, something was not right. As we were finishing our coffee, we suddenly heard a door open. The sound, without a doubt, came from the cold room, as the creaking of those doors was unmistakable. He looked at me, and we remained silent for a few seconds. After a while, we decided to see what had happened. When we arrived, we saw that the only refrigerator door open was the elderly woman's. I was sure I had securely locked the latch, and there was no way it could open by itself. My colleague had little time as a forensic doctor, but the truth is that I was also a bit tense since nothing like this had ever happened to me in any of the morgues where I had worked. I didn't believe in paranormal things, but being there, everything was different. I can't explain how heavy the atmosphere was, especially with what had just happened. I didn't want to scare my colleague further, so I told him not to worry, that probably the door wasn't working well because it was a bit old. I locked the door again where the elderly woman's body was and we left. As the hours passed, he needed to go to the bathroom. After a few minutes, I heard him call my name. I ran to see what had happened. When I entered the bathroom, he was looking at the stalls with a look of terror I had never seen before. Before I could ask what had happened, he pointed to the doors and said, "The elderly woman, the elderly woman." In fact, he could barely speak properly. He was in shock and trembling a lot. It took 2 cups of coffee and about 30 minutes for him to calm down. He said that while washing his hands, he saw the elderly woman watching him through the reflection of the mirror from behind one of the bathroom doors. Honestly, I didn't know what to think at that moment. Part of me wanted to believe him, but another part knew she was dead and locked in a cold room. But he swore he saw her. I felt very bad for the state he was in and told him he could take the rest of the night off, that I would cover for him, and that he should go rest. He thanked me and agreed, but before leaving, he asked me to be careful because he was sure of what he had seen. In reality, I was a bit scared too, as I could see the fear in his eyes, but I had to get back to work since other bodies had arrived. About an hour passed while I was performing an autopsy when the lights started flickering and, in a few seconds, went out completely. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and headed to the place where the fuses were. But as I turned towards the hallway, there was the elderly woman, sitting on one of the gurneys. She didn't move, just stared at me and let out a sinister laugh that still gives me chills. My only reaction was to turn and run. Then, the light came back. I stopped and looked back, and the elderly woman was no longer there. It was as if she had never been there. That night, I decided it had been enough and that I could no longer stay there. I called the person in charge and told him what had happened, saying I was going to leave. I waited outside, and after some time, he arrived. He asked if I was okay, and I said yes, but obviously, I wasn't, and I could no longer keep working there. We went inside and headed to where the elderly woman's body was, and there she was, exactly where I had left her, as if nothing had happened. To summarize the story, during the nearly week she was there, strange things happened, reported by me and the doctors and staff from the other shift. Wanting to end the situation, the owner tried to contact someone who could claim the woman's body for a few days, but to no avail, and no relative appeared. He decided to cremate her that same night. The elderly woman was incinerated, and we never again experienced that feeling of fear, anguish, and bad energy in the morgue. I worked there for another 5 years, and nothing like that ever happened again.
I know that, being a doctor, I shouldn't believe in these things and should stick more to science and what can be explained, but there are many things I've experienced in these places that make me believe there is something beyond our understanding. This story is one of the many I have to tell. I worked in a morgue near the city center. At night, it was just me and the janitor, who mainly stayed to open the gates when bodies arrived. Around 2 in the morning, the body of an 18-year-old girl arrived who had been hit by a car hours earlier. After filling out the paperwork, I began with the procedures, and I don't want to go into details, but she had severe injuries all over her body. After that, I went to talk to the security guard to ask if anyone had come to claim the body. He told me no and that no one had called. I took the opportunity to go to the bathroom, and in the distance, I heard him talking to someone. I hurried, thinking it was a family member who had arrived, but when I got to the waiting room, it was empty. From there, I called him on the intercom to see if it was a relative of the girl, but he said no. It was just a lost young woman asking for directions to her house. I didn't give him much importance and went back to work. At that moment, I was preparing other bodies to hand them over to their responsible parties when, without any explanation, the body of the hit girl fell off the gurney. I only heard the sound of the body hitting the floor. With the noise focused on what I was doing, I jumped in fright. After all, there was no one in that room with me who could have knocked her over, and it was impossible for her to have fallen on her own. But anyway, I needed to put her back in her place. Since I couldn't do it alone, I went to call the janitor to help me, as he was used to doing it when necessary. But when he got to the room and saw the girl, he was speechless, saying nothing, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I asked what was happening, and he replied with a trembling voice that this was the same girl who came to ask for help to get home a few minutes ago. I was paralyzed and didn't know what to say. The only thing that came out of my mouth was, "Are you sure?" And he said yes, it was her, and he was completely sure because she even had the same tattoo on her arm. Together, we lifted her and put her back on the gurney. We left that room and could only comment that it was a lost soul who didn't yet know what had happened and just wanted to go home.
A long time ago, I went through a situation that to this day I cannot explain. I have always been skeptical about the paranormal and things like that. I worked as a security guard for over 20 years in a large public hospital in my city, and during that time, I saw and heard things that made me believe there is more to the supernatural than we can imagine. As I mentioned before, it was an old hospital and, in its early years of operation, there was an attached morgue. However, over time, due to health and logistics issues, it was moved and all its space was kept. Nowadays, it is used only as a kind of storage for the large hospital around it. It was exactly in this place that I went through one of the scariest situations of my entire life. Since it was just a storage, we almost never went there, not even to check it. But on this specific night, I was called to the place. I was outside the hospital doing my rounds as usual, when Sean, my shift partner, called me on the radio asking me to go as quickly as possible to the place, because the janitor swore he saw someone suspicious walking around the storage building. I arrived as quickly as I could. Despite his somewhat trembling voice, he said he was mopping the corridor when he saw a figure that looked like a tall man passing from one side to the other in one of the morgue rooms. That was the most action we had all year, since most of the time everything was peace and quiet. Sean arrived shortly after, and together we started checking the entire place. The place smelled musty, and the atmosphere seemed heavy. I can't explain exactly, but it felt like we weren't welcome there in some way. We began to check everything, room by room and corner by corner. Since it was an old building, its paint was deteriorated, the doors creaked, and the lights, besides being dim, also flickered. It was really the last place anyone would want to be. When we thought we had checked everything, we saw a shadow passing at the end of the corridor. It seemed to be a tall man, but at the same time, it didn't look like anything. It had a human form, but something about it didn't seem right. Then, we heard the heavy creak of a door closing and slamming, echoing at the end of the corridor. I'll be honest that at that moment I shuddered a little, but since there were two of us, I gathered the little courage I had left and followed where the figure had gone. When we turned the corner, we saw it was an old refrigerator room, according to the old sign on its door. I forced its handle, hoping to open it, but it was as if it had been stuck for years and, no matter how much force we applied, it wouldn't move. We asked the janitor about the door key, and he said he didn't know, as it hadn't been opened in years. After a few minutes standing in front of the door, something made us jump, a loud bang coming from inside, making us even more certain that someone was really in there. We shouted loudly, asking whoever was inside to surrender and come out with their hands up, but we got no response. We banged on the door and shouted for them to open it, but again, there was absolute silence. The janitor, being one of the oldest employees at the hospital, said there was no lock on the inside. So, whatever was in there was holding the door shut. But that wasn't the case, because Sean found an iron bar in a nearby room, and just as we were about to force the door, it simply opened. We shone our flashlights inside, and immediately, we couldn't see much, but it was evident that it was a small room, and whatever was in there didn't have many places to hide other than the refrigerator drawers of that old morgue. One by one, Sean and I opened them, and upon inspecting the last one, we looked at each other confused and a bit incredulous, but we both knew what we had seen. It wasn't a person, but an apparition. There was nothing else in that room besides a few old metal stretchers and scattered utensils. There was no window, much less another exit. So, what we saw either didn't leave there or never entered, who knows? In the years that followed, I never experienced anything as scary as that night, and we never saw that shadowy figure walking around the old hospital grounds again.